We are currently on our way to the 4th region of the game, but Genshin's limited event stories still park potential problems in the overall quality of the stories given to us. Granted, Genshin's lore has always been massive and truly a wonder to dive into, but the actual playable quests can get a lot of work. The current structure of Genshin Impact's event system has a lot of weird consequences when it comes to storytelling aspects of the game. 2.7 and 2.4 mitigated this by introducing the Archon Quest interlude system, but given that 2.8 doesn't have any hints of being a permanent event, it's time to voice my criticisms on why Genshin's limited event system is hurting Genshin's story quality from the perspective of the player. We already know that limited events mean fear of missing out on crucial things with no way of playing them. Yes, Genshin's limited event system is made to incentivize continuous play, but the time limit system can burn players out that either don't like the large gaps between story or feel like the overall continuity of the story is jarred and barred. And no, if you say that they should just watch YouTube videos of the cutscenes, then that just sounds like you're trying to put a band-aid on a broken arm. But now, we're going to tackle the overall consequences of limited events on the quality of the story, from the narrative, to its pacing, to how it sets up future events. So, let's begin. The term Schrödinger's Scaramouche basically umbrellas the next set of problems that limited events pose on the current story of Genshin. Did the event really happen because your account wasn't alive when the event occurred in the game? You would think that, yes, it did, but it happened outside of the player's knowledge. But I argue that the game goes against that reasoning. In the Inazuma story quest of 2.1, you get a special cutscene if you've never met Scaramouche because your account hasn't undergone 1.1. The story has to adjust to the point that you haven't met Scaramouche, Mona never saved you, and Fischl never met Mona. Do you see the problem here? The validity and canonity of certain events, even though we as a player like to assume they did happen, is impossible to determine. There becomes a dissonance. The story is never the same for each player. The only constant source of story is the character quests or the Archon Quests, but the events, if the player's account has not yet been conceived yet, didn't happen. Sure, quests like the Irodori Festival or the Golden Apple Archipelago were orchestrated by an outside source, but we can never say for certain that it happened. This puts a lot of additional problems in story quality, because we have the following things. Limited events and the lack of new players repeating content opens the door to a lot of personality inconsistencies and lack of substantial characterization. New players lose out on so much substance that makes a character likable, so much content that expands on the friendships and bonds we see in Tevat. What I mean by this is that a lot of characters face important decisions and weird situations when they're in limited events. Your Albedo is simply the alchemist of the Knights of Avonius that has a mysterious backstory that is unexplained, but my Albedo was somebody that tried to open up to others, has a mysterious twin, befriended Kazuha, Ayaka, Venti, and Xingqiu, and revealed to the traveler that they were the creation of Rhine-daughter. Your Keqing never went through the character development of the 2.4 Lantern Rite. Or, yes, you've heard about Xingqiu and Changyan's friendship, but what about actually playing through and seeing their interactions? Something you just don't get in any of the permanent content. Character dynamics and friendships are put in a strange limbo if you're a new player. And I can see why new players feel like their characters aren't fully fleshed out or have mediocre characterization. It's because they never got the chance to see these characters in weird situations or have to interact with people outside of their comfort zone, which is honestly a shame. Character writing quality absolutely suffers for this. But in terms of the bigger narrative, we have the following. Limited event stories can't have long-lasting and permanent stakes. Here's a good example of this. The dangers that we felt for Albedo in the 2.3 event always had a strange feeling of, there's no way they're gonna hurt Albedo. This is a limited event. And the thing is, I wholeheartedly agree. Limited events can't have permanent stakes because new players that haven't played them would suddenly get confused if a PC dies, or something big happens in the plot that ties in with the limited event. This is exactly what happened with Albedo's story. People who have followed 2.3 but not 1.2 were really confused by the context of Durin and Albedo. Limited events tend to have a safety net because business tends to go back to normal after the event happens. You rarely have events that reference each other because Hoyo is trying their best not to alienate new players. This is why there's hardly any mention of past events when you play any new content. They always just try to remove it or censor it fully because it would be a disservice to people that haven't played the past content when you start talking about things like the Unreconciled Stars, or the Dragon Spine 1.2 event, or the Lantern Rite in 1.3. New players just don't get it. Now, that's not to say that the content can't be translated into permanent story. I imagine really big story parts that were missed are going to be reintegrated, like how Scaramouche had an alternative introduction. But massive reveals like Albedo's origins, Kazuha's past, and other things that have to tie into the future characters' stories need to get explained fully again just in case the player missed it. What happens is that for new players, you get another exposition drop without the cool visuals or the proper build-up like in 2.3 and 2.6 because you missed the event that actually focused on it and gave it a proper story. For older players, we get a rehash of what we already know. Or the worst they can do is act like the information never happened in the first place and leave the new players in the dust. Which, honestly, I wouldn't be surprised. Genshin doesn't really make a lot of callbacks to its past events. Now, my next problem is actually a much weirder one to consider and much more narrative-focused, but the time period and the time gaps between the Archon Quests become horribly muffled. When we finished the Liyue Archon Quest, a full year transpired before Inazuma released for the sole reason of the Lantern Rite event. The Lantern Rite event is canonically a yearly event and was the benchmark for an in-game year, but without it, how does the story justify that the travelers didn't just finish everything in the span of a week? The sense of time in the narrative just feels so dissonant without the limited events to pander out time. My genuine gripe with the limited events is just that they take so much potential in the story's content. The time limit and the way the narrative addresses these random gaps in Genshin's reality is jarring and makes everything feel so inconsequential. The reason these events are so important is because they flesh out a character and make them grow, and they show you situations that you wouldn't have considered in the main plot. But take that away and you lose almost 60% of the character's personality and their bonds with other people. You lose so much world building, so much activity, so much quality. The thing is, these stories don't even have to be limited. The Archon Quest interludes were a great way of immortalizing event quests, and it showed us that a narrative shouldn't give a fuck about these little chapters and slices of life. The time gate of these events just overall hurt the state of Genshin, both gameplay and narrative. New players lose out on experience, while older players are forced to always be active per patch, or else you just miss a massive part of the world building. I feel like Genshin's story would just feel more complete if Hoyo had the foresight to make this content permanent, or even just the stories. The events like the minigames can be limited for all I care, but the stories can't, because narrative in an RPG is a crucial pillar of development. But nevertheless, my name is Aster and thank you for chilling with me.